sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he lost his mother at the tender age of 6 years old. And losing a parent as a child is a pain like no other. It is one of the greatest hardships, one of the greatest calamities that a person can endure. The next day, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he comes and he sees the Prophet ﷺ crying and Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh crying. What was the response of Umar radiallahu anh? He said, "O Prophet of Allah, explain to me why you are crying. If I can't cry, I will force myself to cry. And if I can't force myself to cry, then I will pretend to cry." This was the state of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. Whatever the Prophet ﷺ is doing, if the Prophet ﷺ is happy, the Sahaba are happy. If the Prophet ﷺ is sad, the Sahaba are sad. If the Prophet ﷺ is in despair, they share this despair with the Prophet ﷺ. So there's a question here that why did the Prophet ﷺ endure so much hardship? Why did he face such a rough time during his young age? His father passed away before he was born, mother passes away at the age of 6, and then his grandfather passes away at the age of 8. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Dear viewers, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We start off by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sending peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and his companions until the last day. So alhamdulillah, we've had several weeks break. I don't know whose fault that is. Who can remember where we were the last session that we had? So we spoke in the last session about some of the virtues of Umrah. So alhamdulillah, you guys have had time to now refresh, enjoy your time with your family, and hopefully the fuel tank is full now for the session of the Seerah. So just as a recap, we talked about the great virtues of one intending to perform Umrah in the last session. And we mentioned that right from the outset, when a person intends to perform the Umrah, some of the great virtues that are awaiting the person. Right from the outset, when the person makes the intention for the Umrah, the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions in a hadith that the person is from the delegation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you are a guest traveling to the best of places, Makkah al-Mukarramah. And in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ also highlighted the fact that while you are on this journey, you haven't even reached your destination, your prayers are answered, your sins are forgiven, and poverty is removed from you. Your expenses on the journey, they are rewarded. So, people say, oh, the Umrah ticket is too expensive and it's going to cost me a lot of money, I'm going to lose out. No, rather, the Prophet ﷺ here tells us in this hadith that you are rewarded for your expenses. And in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he said that this journey of Umrah, it removes poverty. Poverty is removed from you. So, and then in the session previous to this, we talked about Halima Sa'diyah, and she came to Makkah al-Mukarramah to pick up a child, as was the custom of the Quraysh, that in that day and age, they used to look for families within the desert to look after their children. And we mentioned there were many reasons for this. Just as a recap, some of the reasons were, at the time in Mecca, infant mortality was high in Mecca at the time. So there were many babies who were dying at a very young age. Disease was widespread. So this was a precaution that the Arabs, they took at the time to send out their children into the desert lifestyle. Another reason was that they wanted to protect the Qurayshi dialect. We mentioned that Mecca was a place where people came from far and wide. So they came with all of their baggage in terms of their different dialects. So the focus was on eloquence in speech. And the Qurayshi people, they wanted to focus on preserving the Qurayshi dialect. So they used to look for families within the desert who were eloquent in speech and who would preserve this dialect for them. And finally, we mentioned that these tribes that were living out in the desert, they were people who had good morals, good ethics. So the focus was on self-discipline of the child during the young ages. It's like sending your child into a boarding school. When a child's in a boarding school, compared to you dropping the child to school day in, day out within a few miles of your house, you can see the difference. The child is independent. He can feed himself, he can clothe himself. From a very, very young age, we see young children going out to boarding schools and they stay away from their parents. This makes the child more mature, more independent, more capable in life. So the Prophet ﷺ, he was picked up by Halima Sa'diyah, and we mentioned that the caravan that came into Mecca, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he was offered to all of the women, and all of them rejected the Prophet ﷺ. Why? Because he was an orphan. They said, what good is this boy? He doesn't have a father. And Halima Sa'diyah, she mentions that it was time to leave Mecca and she didn't have a baby. So she spoke to her husband and they agreed to take Muhammad ﷺ back home with them. And she mentions that no sooner did she pick up the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, she began to see some blessings in her lifestyle. So her milk started to flow. It was sufficient for Muhammad ﷺ and her son Abdullah. And we mentioned the she-camel that they had, the trouble they had with the she-camel on the journey, that it stopped providing milk. And as soon as the Prophet ﷺ, as a young boy, was in their company, the she-camel started to give milk. Her riding animal, the mule, it was the slowest animal on the journey into Mecca. And on the way back, it was the fastest animal. And her friends were asking her, is this the same animal that you rode on when you came into Makkah al-Mukarramah? So these blessings, the blessings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ being in her company, they continued when she got home. When she went home, she realized that the land became fertile, it became lush, it became green. Her animals were able to feed to their fill and provide milk for the family. And because all of the animals, they started supplying milk for the family, they became a surplus of milk. So they were able to now sell the milk to other families and make money from this as well. So she sees this great blessing in the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and after the time she's supposed to hand him back to Amina, she comes and she pleads with Amina that, can you give me more time with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? I promise to take care of him. And at that time we mentioned that the disease that was spreading and the illness that was spreading amongst young children at the time was at its peak. So Amina, she agrees, and Halima Sa'diyah, she takes the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, she extends the contract and she takes him back into the desert. And then we ended on the situation where Jibreel alayhi salam with another angel, they came, they split open the chest of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they took out his heart and they washed it with Zamzam water. And we mentioned during this time that this was a shock for Halima Sa'diyah, so she didn't want any harm to befall Muhammad ﷺ, and she takes him back to Mecca and she hands him back to the care of his mother Amina. Now, during the time the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he was in the care of Amina, there is very little in terms of narrations or events that took place, because, to be quite frank, who knew that this young boy was going to become a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And who would sit there recording in the house of Amina? At that time, there was very little in terms of recording. So, due to this, there's only a few incidents in the seerah which were narrated. Now, one of these incidents is that Amina, after some time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ being in her care, she decides to take the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to Yathrib. Now, there's a difference of opinion why she decided to take Muhammad ﷺ into Yathrib. Some of the scholars, they say that the father of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he was buried there. And some of the other scholars, they say it was due to the relations, the cousins that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had in Medina. If we remember back, the great-grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, Hashim, he married a girl from Medina. So is this a coincidence? Or is this the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Rather, it is the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why we see many, many years later, when we fast forward, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he migrates to Medina, he spends some time in Quba with his extended family members, enjoying the ties of kinship. So the great grandmother of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Salma bint Amr, and she was from the tribe of Banu Adi ibn al-Najjar. And this is the wife of Hashim, the great grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Amina, she makes an intention to visit Medina, and we mentioned that the custom of the Arabs at the time was to preserve their lineage. This was very important, genealogy. What is your family tree? What tribe are you from? Because this was the Jahili society pre-Islam, that your support that you had from your relatives, your friends, your family members was dependent on the people you knew and the people you associated yourselves with. So the stronger your relationship, the better chances of you being protected in this society. It depends about how many men you have on your side. We remember when Abdul Muttalib, he had an issue with one of his uncles in Mecca, and his uncle was depriving him of all of the things that were given to him. What did he do? He wrote a letter to who? His uncles in Medina. And his uncle from Medina came with, I think, 70 or 80 men from Medina at the time. So we see here that your self-defense in society, if I can call it, was dependent on the people you knew in society and how powerful they were. So Amina, she goes to Yathrib with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a young boy, and also Ayman. We mentioned that Ayman was one of the milk mothers of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam during his young age, and she was a gift that Abdul Muttalib had gifted Abdullah and his family. So they make the preparations, they go out on this journey, and as we mentioned previously, that this journey is not a journey like you do today. In 10, 12 hours you jump on a plane and you're on the other side of the world. No, this was a journey of days and even weeks at a time, because they had camels, slow riding animals. So this journey was a long journey. And when a person sets out to travel approximately 400 miles to Medina, it's not a case of you go there for the weekend and you're back the following week. No. This was a journey where Amina, she planned to stay in Medina for a prolonged period. Then some of the books of Seerah, they mentioned that she stayed in Medina for a period of 1 month. So they set out, they get to Medina, and they see their relatives in Medina. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he spent some time with his uncles as a young boy. And many, many years later, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was in Medina, he recalled some of the situations that took place while he was a young boy in Medina. So for example, he stopped outside a house and he pointed to this house and he said, this was the house in which me and my mother, we stayed during our first visit to Medina. And then he points to a pond and he says, this was the pond in which I started to learn how to swim. And then he pointed to a playing field and he says, this is the field in which I used to run and play with the young boys during my time in Medina. So the Prophet ﷺ, he stays in Medina for a period of time, and during this time there was a very interesting incident that took place. And this is mentioned in many of the early books of Seerah. Ibn Ishaq mentions this, Ibn Hisham mentions this as well, Al-Waqidi mentions this as well, that two Jewish people, they came to see the Prophet ﷺ as a young boy. And at the time, Ayman was taking care of him in the field. So they came up to her and they said, where is this young boy whose name is Ahmad? So remember in previous sessions we mentioned that the two famous names of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ were Muhammad and Ahmad. And Amina, the mother of the Prophet ﷺ, she used to love calling the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with the name of Ahmad. So as a young boy, the Prophet ﷺ running around the streets of Medina, many of his cousins, they know him as Ahmad. Muhammad means the one who is eternally praised, we mentioned. And we mentioned Ahmad is the one who praises. So the Prophet ﷺ, he is the one who is eternally praised. And we see every single day on a daily basis the Prophet ﷺ is being praised by the Ummah. And also Ahmad, the one who praises Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the most. So the Prophet ﷺ, he is the one who venerates, who honors Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the most. Now these two Jewish men, they came to Ayman and they asked her that, where is this young boy Ahmad? We want to see him. So she brought him to them, and they looked at him, and then they turned him around and they picked up his garment from the back and they uncovered the seal of prophethood. So we know the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had a mark on the back of his neck, and this was the seal of prophethood. The moment they saw this seal of prophethood on his back, they said a few verses which startled Ayman. They said that this is going to be the boy who is going to be the prophet of this ummah, and he will migrate to this place called Yathrib. And they mentioned some of the involvement regarding some of the battles, that he was going to be victorious in battles that take place. So Ayman, hearing this for the first time, she's shocked, and she goes back to Amina and she narrates the story. Amina, as a young mother at this time, she's fearful for her child. So as a precautionary step, she decides to leave Yathrib sooner than planned. So she prepares to leave Yathrib, and they get to a place called Al-Abwa. And this is where the mother of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she falls ill, and as a result of her illness, she passes away, and she is buried in Al-Abwa. There's a difference of opinion on how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he got back to Mecca. Some scholars, they mentioned that Ayman, she transported the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam back to Mecca. Others mentioned that Ayman, she went back to Medina. She took care of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with his cousins. During the time, a message was sent to Mecca to Abdul Muttalib, and once he received this message, he came back to Medina and he took the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam back to Mecca. Regardless, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he arrives safely in Mecca. Just as a side point here, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he lost his mother at the tender age of 6 years old. And losing a parent as a child is a pain like no other. It is one of the greatest hardships, one of the greatest calamities that a person can endure. Because the mother has a degree of attention that only the mother can give to the child. We see sometimes what happens when a father is entrusted with looking after the affairs of the home. The mother has gone out for a day, and the father is having lots of problems with the children. It takes him 3-4 hours to get the kids ready. He doesn't know what to do in the kitchen. He doesn't know how to prepare the home. So, and the Quran makes mentions of this, that the mother has a degree which is higher in rank because of the sacrifices during childbirth, during the 9 months that you were in the womb of your mother. And the Quran mentions this in great detail. حَمَلَتْهُ أُمُّهُ وَهْنًا عَلَى وَهْنٍ, that his mother carried him, increasing her in weakness upon weakness. She fed you, she clothed you. Sleepless nights when the parents, they were looking after you. When you became ill, the parents, they don't sleep. They make sure that they check upon you. As a young child, you've fallen asleep in your room. Yet before they go to bed, they come to your room. They check upon you as a child. Make sure you're sleeping fine. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Luqman, وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ, that we have enjoined upon you care for your parents. حَمَلَتْهُ أُمُّهُ وَهْنًا عَلَى وَهْنٍ, his mother carried him, increasing her in weakness upon weakness. وَفِصَالُهُ فِي عَامَيْنِ, and his weaning is 2 years. أَنِشْكُرْ لِي وَلِوَالِدَيْكَ إِلَيَّ الْمَصِيرُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructs us to be grateful to him and our parents, and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the final destination. So, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on one occasion when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam later on in his life, he was staying in Medina at the time. On his way back to Medina with the companions, he diverts from the pathway. The companions, ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, they followed him. So we see the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he takes a diversion from the path, and they don't ask him, why are you going this way? No, they just follow him. And this hadith is mentioned by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. He mentions the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he visited, when he took this diversion, he visited the grave of his mother. And he wept. And everyone there wept with him. This hadith is mentioned in Muslim. It's mentioned in the Muslim of Imam Ahmad. and also it's mentioned in Abu Dawood. So Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he's talking about the time the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he visits the grave of his mother. He becomes emotional, he starts to cry, and the companions, they cry with him. And we can learn a great lesson from this, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is crying, and the companions, they see him crying and they start to cry with him. This is true love and affection for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Many incidents in which the Sahaba, they saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam doing something and they followed suit. At the time of the Battle of Badr, Umar ibn al-Khattab, when the prisoners of war were captured, prisoners of war, they constituted a problem awaiting resolution, because it was a new phenomenon in the history of Islam. Previously, the Sahaba, the companions, they were persecuted. Now, when they came to Medina and the first battle took place, this was a change in the hand of the Muslims. They were starting to become a force. They had captured some prisoners of war, and now a decision had to be made about what was to be done with these prisoners of war. So the Prophet ﷺ, he asks his trusted companions, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, what is your opinion regarding these prisoners of war? And Umar ibn al-Khattab says, being the person he is, hand my cousins over to me, hand Ali's cousins over to him, and all the people who associate themselves with Abu Bakr and Uthman and the rest of the companions, hand them over to their respected relations, and we will sort them out. Meaning, we'll sort them out. Because, and he mentions his reasoning for this, he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will know that there is no inclination in our hearts towards the mushrikeen. But the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam at this time, he asked the other companions, and he took the opinion of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, which was to ransom these prisoners. The next day, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he comes and he sees the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam crying, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu crying. What was the response of Umar radiallahu anhu? He said, "O Prophet of Allah, explain to me why you are crying. If I can't cry, I will force myself to cry. And if I can't force myself to cry, then I will pretend to cry." This was the state of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Whatever the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is doing, if the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is happy, the Sahaba are happy. If the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is sad, the Sahaba are sad. If the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is in despair, they share this despair with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this was one of the occasions as well when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he received revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preferred the choice of Umar ibn al-Khattab. So in this hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentions that I sought my Lord's permission to seek forgiveness for my mother. So I made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to seek forgiveness for my mother, but He did not permit me. I then sought permission to visit her grave, and He permitted me to visit her grave. So this is the conclusion of the hadith. And we mentioned in previous sessions that there is this scholarly discussion about the status of the parents of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Are they believers? Are they not believers? And I mentioned the safest position for us to adopt is that Allah knows best. Allah knows best, and as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, وَلَا تُسَأَلُونَ عَمَّا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ, that we will not be asked about these people. This is not going to be one of the three questions that we're going to be asked in the grave. This is not going to be something that we're going to be asked about on the Day of Judgment. So we leave this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we think good about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his family. Now, during this time, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he visited the grave of his mother. Previous to this, it was impermissible for anyone to visit the graveyard. If a person passes away, the companions, they used to come, bury the body into the ground, and leave the cemetery. But after this, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, I used to forbid you to visit the graves. But now this has been lifted. And now you are able to go into the graveyard, you are able to pray for the deceased. And this was the instruction of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that when a person enters the graveyard, you say Assalamu alaikum ahlul diyar min al-mu'minin wal-muslimin wa inna insha'Allah bikum lahiqun as'alullah lana wa lakum al-afiyah. So this is a dua that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he taught us, that peace be upon you, O people, O Muslims. Inshallah, we will one day join you, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep you safe and sound. So this is a reflection point, a point of acknowledgement that we are here today in this earth. and soon we are going to be joining our companions, our brothers and sisters beneath the ground. Now, coming back to the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a particular point of interest here is that Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he mentions that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he cried, and the companions, they cried with him. So here, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu is confirming that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he cried publicly. And there were only a very limited number of occasions when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he cried publicly. So we just mentioned the time when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he cried when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the verses regarding the prisoners of war. Another time when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he cried publicly when he lost his son, Ibrahim. So, and this was another time the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he cried publicly when he felt the love for his mother and the pain the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam must have been going through at enduring her death as a young boy. Now, although the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he never saw his father, and his mother died when he was at the tender age of 6, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not deprive the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam of a loving, caring individual who would take care of him. Meaning, if we look at all of the people who were associated with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam during his young age, there were people who loved the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who took great care of him. Halima Sa'diyah, she promised Amina that she's going to take great care of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Abdul Muttalib, as we will come to know. So whoever was in this position of guardianship, guarding the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they took care of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they took a lot of great care. So when you compare this to your own child, it's like your own child. This is how they took the care of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a plan for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Alam yajidka yatiman fa'awa. That did he not find you an orphan and give you refuge? Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually taking care of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, after the death of Amina, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he is entrusted in the care of Abdul Muttalib, the grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We mentioned Abdul Muttalib was a very busy man. He was a very respected man in society. He had a lot of responsibilities. Why was this? Because not only was he the leader of his tribe, but he was the leader of the whole Qurayshi tribe. He was the chieftain of the whole tribe of Quraysh. So he had responsibilities in terms of leadership. He had responsibilities in terms of looking after his own family. He had many grandchildren. And now he has to take care of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yet despite this, many of the books of Seerah, they mention that Abdul Muttalib, he made time for his grandson, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Specifically, one narration is quite famous. Abdul Muttalib, he used to have a raised platform. During the time of Asr, some of the part of the Kaaba would fall into the shade of the Kaaba. So there was a raised platform which was connected to the Kaaba. And there was a special seat for Abdul Muttalib. Nobody could sit there. None of the other members of the Quraysh, the sons of Abdul Muttalib, or his grandchildren. This was a special seat. You know, you have a special seat for the queen, the throne. They sit on the throne. So this was a special seat. And this was a social place where the Quraysh people, they used to come. They used to talk about their affairs, discuss the affairs of the Quraysh. So one day, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he runs and he jumps on this seat. So the uncles, they come and they try to get him off the seat, that this is not for you. And Abdul Muttalib, he comes and he says, leave him alone. This is my son. And he mentions that I swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is something special about him. Kids have these tendencies, right? When you're in the masjid, they want to run up on the minbar. They see how far they can climb up the minbar before you grab them. They want to speak on the mic. And everybody's trying to ush them away. Get away from this. It's not when you become an Imam, then you can speak on the mic. So they were, and kids, some kids are quite smart, right? They want to see how far they can pull the string before it snaps. So here the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's sitting in the seat of Abdul Muttalib, and Abdul Muttalib, even when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is sitting there, he doesn't move him off. No, rather he picks him up and he sits with him on his lap. So this was a great respect Abdul Muttalib gave to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it's also mentioned that one of the people that came to visit Abdul Muttalib, he also mentioned, he was looking at the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said, take great care of this boy, because there is something special about him. So Abdul Muttalib, he calls Abu Talib, his son, and he says, listen to what this man is saying. And the man repeated that, take great care of this boy, because he seems to be a person who's going to be somebody great. So this struck with Abu Talib. And when Abdul Muttalib was in his final days, he entrusted Abu Talib to take care of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Another time, we mentioned just very quickly, the uncles of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they realized, and also Abdul Muttalib realized, that there was something fascinating about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In one of the battles where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I think it was the Battle of Fijar, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his job, he was a participant in the battle, but he wasn't on the front line. His job was merely to look for the arrows of the attacking army. So wherever he finds an arrow, he picks it up and he collects all the arrows together and he takes them back to his uncles. And the Abdul Muttalib, he mentions that the days in which the Prophet ﷺ, he stayed at home and the days he participated, there was a very big difference. When the Prophet ﷺ participated, they were victorious, they were strengthened, and it was very easy for them to fight in the battle. And the time when he was at home, they really struggled. And even here on this occasion, the uncles of the Prophet ﷺ, they lost some camels. So they need somebody to go and find the camels, and they selected the Prophet ﷺ to find these camels. And in the books of Seerah, it's mentioned that he was never assigned a task except that he was successful. We have Brother Yusuf talking about tasks all the time, right? And how important task management is, to make sure that you finish that task from start to finish. Whenever the Prophet ﷺ, he was an exemplary role model, right? Even in the assignment of a task, he was successful. He was diligent. He made sure that he completed his task. So they sent him out to look for these camels. The Prophet ﷺ, when he goes out to look for the camels, this is brought to the attention of Abdul Muttalib. And there's a long time after which the Prophet ﷺ comes back. During this time, Abdul Muttalib, he gets very concerned for the care of the Prophet ﷺ, and he was furious at the uncles that, why did you send Muhammad out? So this shows that Abdul Muttalib, he had a special care and concern for the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Finally, again, at the tender age of 8, once again, the Prophet ﷺ, he is orphaned. And before Abdul Muttalib passes away, he entrusts Muhammad ﷺ in the care of his son, Abu Talib. And now Abu Talib takes care of the Prophet ﷺ. So there's a question here, that why did the Prophet ﷺ endure so much hardship? Why did he face such a rough time during his young age? His father passed away before he was born, mother passes away at the age of 6, and then his grandfather passes away at the age of 8. So the scholars, they've discussed this at length. And some of the reasons for this is that, firstly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he took care of the Prophet ﷺ's upbringing. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions regarding Musa alayhi salam, وَلِتُصْنَعَ عَلَىٰ عَيْنِي, that you may be brought up under my eye, under my protection. So here there is a full conditioning of the environment in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is in, the people he is associating himself with. In fact, in one book of hadith, it's mentioned that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he made an intention to go to a place where there was a festival. And before the Prophet ﷺ, he gets into the mix of the festival, the loud music is shut off to him and he falls asleep. So when he wakes up, the festival is over. And then he did this the next day as well. He made this intention to go out again and mix with the people of Mecca. And the same thing happened. As soon as he comes to the festival, he falls asleep. So here, through this, we see the Prophet ﷺ is conditioning the environment in which the Prophet ﷺ is in. The people who the Prophet ﷺ is with, they are people who cared for him, who nurtured for him, and looked for his welfare and his upbringing. Of these qualities, we mentioned that a person who is an orphan, who has neither mother or father to love you at a very young age, it usually makes the child more independent, more mature. Even when a child is born in poverty, it is usually a child who is born in poverty is usually more mature than one who is spoiled and born in a luxurious environment. And we see this. For example, we have young children in third world countries, tender children, 7, 8, 9, and they're looking after babies. The mother and the father, they have gone off to work. And these young children, they are looking after these young babies, feeding them, clothing them, making sure they go to the washroom, looking after their needs. And then if we look in this country, would we entrust somebody like a 16-year-old with a baby? We think twice, right? You can't clean your room, you're going to look after my child. So these difficult circumstances that the Prophet ﷺ was in, they played a part in preparing the Prophet ﷺ for becoming a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in a hadith, in fact, the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions that the messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the prophets, are tested the most severely. Then the next best, then the next best. A man is tried according to his religion. If he is firm in his religion, then his trials will be more severe. If he is weak in his religion, then he is tried according to his strength in religion. So according to this hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are tested the most severely. And what we can learn from this, that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, being an orphan, even when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam became a prophet, he talked at length, it's mentioned in the Quran, in verses of the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, regarding the good treatment one should give to an orphan. In fact, in the verses in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions regarding our religion and what righteousness is. ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله. That righteousness is not that you turn your faces to the east or the west. Rather, it is in certain things that you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you believe in the last day, the angels, the books, the prophets, and you give your wealth in spite of your love for it. وَآتَ الْمَالَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ ذَوِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ. That you give to your relatives, the orphans, the needy. And in one hadith, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentioned that he who cares for an orphan will be like myself, with myself in Jannah. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, imagine this scene, right? And we'll finish on this hadith. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is going to be on the top level of Jannah. The top level of Jannah is under the arsh of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with wealth. We may not be able to physically look after a child, but there's many charities out there. They do sponsorship schemes where you can donate a sum of money and you can look after a child for a year. So we can get involved in these schemes where we pay to look after an orphan child. Inshallah, as a result of this hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we will be like this with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Jannah. So this concludes our seerah session for today. Inshallah, in the upcoming sessions, we'll talk a little bit about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam being a shepherd and some of the benefits of him being a shepherd during his young age. And there was a few other incidents that took place. One of them is Hilf al-Fudul, which we'll talk about in the upcoming sessions. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. رسول الله طالب